Howdy y'all, welcome back. Thank you for being here. When we speak of giants, is it any coincidence that the seemingly mythical specimen, a precursor to man, or some would say a gift from the heavens, would have found references that have seeded their way into every aspect of modern day life? Yet, to the scientific world, giants are nothing more than a speculative fantasy, a farce, concocted by multiple persons throughout numerous centuries. Somehow, the interspersed legends have interwoven themselves so that the elegant, massive burial chambers, proof of the otherworldly beings, the evidence one might need to prove a biblical type occurrence, have all been discredited. The funny part is, coincidentally, until the Smithsonian institution came along, a majority of mankind, including America's most famous president, believed that giants existed. And furthermore, the abundance of claims of giant skeletons of man being found in America was only made more credible by the hundreds of other burial mounds being found throughout the rest of the known world. Some will claim the bones are of the Nephilim, a set of creatures outlined in the Bible, essentially the offspring of fallen angels and humans. To others, these bones are not larger than life humanoids, but rather a worldwide manifestation of greed, where somehow hundreds of individuals, some with seemingly no means to do so, fabricated entire burial mounds and filled them with assorted animal bones to make them look like larger than average humans. Sounds egregious, doesn't it? While we have a handful of documented instances of this occurring, mostly in America in the 19th century, we also have hundreds of documented excavations of untouched burial mounds, which revealed numerous skeletons of at least 7 feet in height. What makes this so interesting to me is that essentially 99% of the population believed in giants until roughly the mid-19th century. I say that because most of academia believed in giants up until this time period, and the lack of a diverse education for the majority of the people in the world made their understanding very limited. Between the three Abrahamic religions, which all make mention of giants, down to the numerous burial mounds being excavated at that time, not just in America but worldwide, to the stories throughout the old world, myths and legends of giants, but also architectural history, which was tied to giants, castles said to be built by giants, castles built upon giants to keep them contained, and castles which had been destroyed by giants. This is all information that most people had at their fingertips in the 19th century. And as we dive into today's video, we will begin to see the outstanding account of giants, some sensationalized, which shaped society's outlook through the 1800s. We will try to decode the currently accepted narrative regarding giants while also entertaining alternate theories about their existence, as well as examining news articles from the 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. We will also dive into a few outlandish claims, and we will have a very thorough look through some of these bones that were said to have been uncovered. This is a deep dive video today, one which should satiate the appetite of you who have been asking for a longer video. So let's get right into it. Essentially, the current scientific community tells us that Europeans arrived to America and embraced the myths of a pre-Columbian settlement from the Old World, which reframed colonization as the continuation of a primordial past. The settlers found intricate fortifications and earthworks, which according to the narrative, reminded them of their European ancestors, and thus they developed a theory that the mound builders were of a Celtic stock. This appears to be a vast underselling of what was actually occurring. For example, the Susquehannock, which is now a word my devices do not recognize, were a vast group of indigenous people who resided along the length of the Susquehanna River from New York through Pennsylvania into Maryland and exiting at the Chesapeake Bay. The Susquehannock were said to have ruled this entire landscape with little resistance from outside groups. The Susquehannock first formed after the Little Ice Age in New York, and as conditions improved, they headed south along the river which now bears their name, towards the Chesapeake Bay. According to their narrative, the Susquehannock established a ferry in Lancaster crossing the Susquehanna River, which is over 1 mile wide, and created a massive fortified and palisaded town in what is today Lancaster by the year 1550. By the year 1605, The Susquehannock, who hunted and fished along the river, but utilized Lancaster as their home base, according to this narrative, outgrew the town. This, however, may have been caused by first contact with European settlers. In 1608, the notorious John Smith met with what he described as 60 giant warriors, all standing at least 2 meters tall, including the women. Some of the men were described at being well over 2 meters or 6 feet 6 inches tall. These were the Susquehannock. They were described as living in fortified palisaded quarters. An early 20th century excavation in Lancaster revealed their original city contained at least 25 unique structures of significant size. John Smith also described the Susquehannock warriors as having exquisite armor, exotic pelts, unique hatchets and knives, and most of all, brass weaponry, which they had apparently obtained from the French. What a coincidence! We have what are described as giant indigenous people already containing European weaponry when first documented by Europeans, who already built fortified and palisaded structures. These Susquehannock essentially towered over the European settlers, at least size-wise. John Smith described their fortified town in Lancaster as having multiple cannons. Furthermore, and this is the real kicker, the Lenape, who ruled over much of the Delaware River, including Philadelphia, were said to have been overpowered by the Susquehannock in the early 17th century. After many brutal raids, which destroyed Lenape cities, an agreement was reached in 1638 in which the Lenape would pay tribute to the Susquehannock in order to maintain their lands on the Delaware. So, according to the narrative, giants, or the Susquehannock, ruled over nearly all of Pennsylvania in the 17th century, as well as parts of New York. While that was occurring, we also have the Susquehannock being employed by the British, as we're told following the establishment of the province of Maryland in 1634, the Susquehannock helped construct some of the early settlements. The Susquehannock were described as relentless workers. Following a 1641 battle with the Jesuits, the Susquehannock were labeled enemies of the province. Read between the lines there. For 10 years, the Susquehannock demolished British camps before finally agreeing to the 1652 Articles of Peace and Friendship between the Susquehannock and the province of Maryland. The Susquehannock relinquished their claim to territory on either side of Chesapeake Bay, but became Britain's main indigenous trade supplier. In 1660, the Susquehannock joined the First Esopus War between the Lenape and the Dutch, fighting on the side of the Dutch, leading to a quick Dutch victory. By 1661, the Susquehannock had united with the Oneida people of New York, thus expanding their territory. By 1671, the Jesuit report stated that a large group of united indigenous peoples, including the Seneca, teamed up and waited for the adult males of the Susquehannock town to leave. Once all the adult males had left the Susquehannock town, the United Seneca and other indigenous groups attempted to raid the town. However, the Susquehannock boys, all said to be ages roughly 9 to 14, were able to easily defeat the other indigenous people who were said to have greatly outnumbered them. The Susquehannock young men were described as nearly the same size as the full-size indigenous adult warriors who attacked them, and the Susquehannock had a greater skill in defense and warfare, leading to their successful defense of their town. Essentially, it appears the Susquehannock were giants of the age, able to conquer anything they set out to, and yet we don't hear mention of them today. This is all because they were nearly wiped out completely by the end of the 18th century. In 1675, the Susquehannock were tricked out of their Pennsylvania town under auspices of better lands in Maryland. At the same time, the 5 nations of the Iroquois banded together and were provided European weaponry by the colonizers under auspices of eradicating the Susquehannock. The governor of Maryland pushed the Susquehannock to settle in the Great Falls, which is just 10 miles away from where Washington, D.C. sits today. Are you beginning to read between the lines? As the Susquehannock began to settle in and around Great Falls, the tribe was subsequently blamed for raids on the British without any proof. In 1675, an army of over 1,000 men was led by Washington across the Potomac to obliterate the Susquehannock. Yes, I said Washington. We're speaking of John Washington, the great-grandfather of the first president of the United States of America, George Washington. This army was also led by Thomas Truman. Isn't it strange how family members of this massive army that crossed the Potomac River to wipe out the Susquehannock in the 1600s would all go on to be presidents of the United States? After these raids by the British and the Iroquois, the Susquehannock took refuge in the Piedmont of Virginia, where they would remain for the next few years. A band of Susquehannock leaders eventually left Virginia to try to recapture their once vast town in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. By 1680, only 26 Susquehannock families remained in Virginia, with the rest returning to Lancaster. Here in Lancaster, they established a new fortified town. The Susquehannock became known as the Conestoga, and the offshoot of the Susquehanna River which they settled became known as the Conestoga River. By 1701, Conestoga town was made official by a deed and subsequent treaty organized by William Penn. For the next 60 years, the Susquehannock giants, now reduced to being called the Conestoga, held one of the most important territories in British America. Have you ever heard of a cigar being called a stogie? The Susquehannock introduced the European settlers to the crop tobacco, and more directly to the cigar, which was known for centuries as a stogie. Conestoga, stogie. Another major aspect, a contribution that seemed to come directly out of this Conestoga town, was the Conestoga wagon, or the covered wagon, the same wagons that you saw traversing the West. Basically how America won the West was with these wagons that were said to be invented by the Susquehannock Conestoga. The more important facet is the long rifle, which most people know today as the Kentucky rifle, was actually first titled a Pennsylvania or Conestoga rifle. The origin of the long or Conestoga rifle, which reshaped hunting and fur trade in America, was said to be pioneered by none other than the Susquehannock, constructed in or around the Conestoga town in Lancaster, and then subsequently developed around the rest of the world. The first documented Conestoga makers were Robert Baker and Martin Malines, both of which started their companies in Lancaster in 1719. In 1763, in an event known as the Paxton Boys Massacre, one of the most notorious and covered-up tragedies in American history occurred. A group of colonists entered the Conestoga town in the dead of night and eradicated every Susquehannock that was living there. After this event, there was said to be only 14 Susquehannock left alive in Pennsylvania, yet 2 weeks after this event, the Paxton Boys returned and were said to have finished the job. There is no mention of the Susquehannock in Lancaster after 1768. In 1845, 6 Susquehannock were said to be living among other indigenous tribes in New York. The Susquehannock filed for an injunction against the Pennsylvania government, and in 1869 they were bequeathed 200 acres of land in Lancaster. Yet, by 1941, a bill was introduced claiming that only one single Susquehannock chief remained in all of America who looked over roughly 80 to 90 individuals. The bill was passed to protect these individuals, but was vetoed by Pennsylvania Governor Arthur James, who claimed that all the Susquehannock had died in 1763. Today, the Susquehannock Conestoga are considered the most infamous of the unrecognized tribes of America. Their history is all but forgotten, their people all but gone. Now, mind you, while this all occurred, we have the majority of society in America with little knowledge of the inner workings of this whitewashing of history. Furthermore, as the last vestiges of the Susquehannock and other indigenous groups were being removed from their lands and settlers were moving in, we have hundreds if not thousands of burial mounds and other earthworks and fortifications being discovered all across the country. While John Smith's accounts from the early 1600s may be considered embellished, we have hundreds of documented stories, newspaper articles, and even scientific excavations of burial mounds and earthworks, which revealed not only a highly sophisticated class of people who seemingly had a very powerful culture, but we have countless examples of skeletons, well over 7 feet tall, being discovered within these ancient structures in America. As I said earlier, it was common belief well into the 20th century that not only did giants exist, but they most likely existed in America, as it was, according to the narrative, the last landscape yet to be fully conquered. Sensationalized or not, as photography began to accompany these discoveries, we have something which appears downright nefarious that occurs. We have the creation of the Smithsonian Institute, essentially created to lord over the excavations and discoveries being found in America. Where was the Institute created? Washington, D.C., just miles away from where the giants of Susquehannock descent were forced to live. When was the Smithsonian first developed? 1816, and made official by a Congress charter in 1818. Who were the original members? The architect for the Capitol building, Benjamin Latrobe, architect William Thornton, as well as American presidents John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, as well as the Marquis de Lafayette. The question then becomes, what exactly did these gentlemen know about ancient indigenous artifacts? And it gets stranger. The charter for the Smithsonian actually expired in 1838, and the entire museum was said to be in limbo, with thousands of artifacts undocumented. We're told it was actually the National Institution, which began in 1840, which continued the Smithsonian's original legacy. But wait, there is a Smithsonian today. How is that possible? Apparently, in 1829, British scientist James Smithson left his fortune to his nephew, Henry James Hungerford. When Henry died childless just 6 years later, in 1835, the entire estate passed on to the United States government, estimated to be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The guise was, this fortune would only be passed to America if they founded an institution to focus on archaeology, and it was in Washington, D.C. Congress officially accepted the bequeathal and pledged the faith of the United States to the Charitable Trust on July 1st, 1836. Smithson left over $500,000, equivalent to over $14 million today, to the government of the United States. However, adjusted for GDP, Smithson's bequeathal could be more comparable to $220 million today. Smithson left this money under the rather vague mandate that it be used, quote, for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, end quote. It took another 6 years following the establishment of the National Institute in 1840 for the Smithsonian Institution to officially become an American trust, an American investment, on August 10, 1846. Tying this back to the history of giants, we have the ever-popular American Antiquities, which was released in 1833. This book crystallized the idea of a lost race of giant men. It referenced the giants mentioned in the book of Genesis and claimed that they created the monuments of North America before being exterminated. From the establishment of America in 1776, nearly all Americans writing about the history used the myth of the mound-building race through at least the early 1900s. In 1832, a massive 7-foot-tall mummy in European-style armor, accompanied by metal tools, exotic tree bark, and massive arrowheads, was found in Fall River, Massachusetts, and was titled The Skeleton in Armor, and was written about in depth by numerous scholars, including Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The massive skeleton was showcased as a giant of the past until 1843, when the entire library it was housed in was lost during the Great Fire. In North America, according to the current narrative, the earthworks and mounds were being conflated with those of South America, which also contained massive skeletons and other seemingly European tools and effigies. The South American ruins and architecture are now attributed today to the Toltecs, but we still have not put our finger on the pulse to see what is truly happening here. Hundreds of newspaper articles throughout the 19th and early 20th century describe the discovery of giant skeletons, sometimes with features like horns, often attributed to the Nephilim. For example, a massive skeleton unearthed in Tennessee toured the state as a specimen of this lost race. Preachers, doctors, and journalists confirmed it to be a humanoid creature despite its standing height, which was estimated to be upwards of 20 feet tall. Throughout the 19th century, some scholars expressed doubt about the excavations of purported giants, but had little impact on public perception. Many readers embraced the skeletons as evidence of biblical history against unpopular experts whose discoveries undermined a literal interpretation of the Bible. However, little can be explained about the thousands of skeletons which were unearthed, and even less can be deciphered about the whereabouts of these skeletons today. As belief began to change, we have unproven claims that the Smithsonian Institution had custody of many of these giant skeletons, and this was the auspices for that organization's founding. It's also theorized that thousands of giant skeletons were disposed of in the early 1900s. Around that same time, we have ethnologist Cyrus Thomas releasing Report on the Mound Explorations for the Smithsonian Institution. In this piece, Thomas claims definitively that North America's earthworks were built by earlier indigenous people who were not giants. By 1934, the curator of the Smithsonian Institution spent the entirety of his career promoting claims that giants did not exist, which by that time was then accepted as the official scientific narrative. That being said, it has since been proven that before the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the Smithsonian collected at least 18,000 unique skeletons from hundreds of different mounds, earthworks, and ruins around America. Where are these skeletons today? Looking east into Europe, we also have the giant of Castelnau, only recently debunked. Up until roughly 2022, the giant of Castelnau, discovered in 1890 in France, was considered to be one of the largest persons ever uncovered. The skeleton consisted of a femur, a tibia, and part of a humerus, all of which would have made the individual, who was buried in a ritualistic fashion in a burial mound, stand at over 10 feet tall. However, in 2022, these bones were debunked as being that of a cave bear, which was, for some reason, buried in the same fashion as a high-ranking warrior of the Neolithic age. Do you see how this entire narrative, from start to finish, could be considered plausible deniability? Did giants walk the earth? I believe so. Did giants exist even a few hundred years ago? If the year was 1900, according to simple folk like me and you, yes, giants did exist. However, according to modern academia, this is simply not true. Essentially, the Smithsonian has taken so much of the evidence, over 18,000 skeletons in America, that they have wiped the artifacts and any proof off of the earth. Whether the truth points to giants being real or proves otherwise, we have very little to go on other than the word of devious rich scholars and presidents in the 19th century. At the same time, what would be the reason to cover up so much history? To hide the artifacts and skeletons and the proof which was uncovered? Why were these mounds excavated and then covered over and then built on top of? Why do we have an entire population of alleged giants, the Susquehannock, which were forced into little more than becoming a myth? I'll end this video with a quote from a speech by Abraham Lincoln at Niagara Falls in 1848. And I quote, "It calls upon the indefinite past, when Columbus first sought this continent, when Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his Maker, then, as now, Niagara was roaring here. The eyes of that species of extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds of America have gazed on Niagara as ours do now. Contemporary with the whole race of men and older than the first man, Niagara is strong and fresh today as 10,000 years ago." End quote.